Welcome to ATARC's webinar series. My name is Jonathan Albaum, and I am the Federal CTO for ServiceNow. And today I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel. I want to begin by welcoming all of our attendees. Today we're going to be addressing the American Rescue Plan. The American Rescue Plan is President Biden's signature achievement in his first few months in office. It aligns with his top priority of providing COVID relief to all Americans. The $1.9 trillion act was passed in March and creates significant requirements for all agencies, at all levels of government to speed up the U.S. recovery from the economic and health effects of the pandemic. The agencies that are most responsible for implementing the ARP all rely heavily on technology, which really isn't very surprising when you recognize that the president's plan requires all levels of government to be firing on all cylinders to ensure that the $1.9 trillion is used effectively and efficiently in support of the American people. So at ServiceNow, we make government work better for federal employees and the people they serve. And one of the most important ways we do this is by ensuring that public sector can engage with their customers in the best way possible. And we're working across agencies to streamline citizen service delivery. We're working with agencies to manage vaccine distribution and working with a variety of organizations to enable a safe return to offices and to schools. So these are all key elements of the American Rescue Plan. So I'm very interested to hear from our panelists today on how they're supporting these and other aspects of the ARP. So today we're going to have some back and forth between myself and our panelists. We're going to have some poll questions. And I want to also encourage our audience to submit your own questions. At the end of today's presentation, we'll have a chance to go through these. So please send them in. And also remember to answer the poll questions as we get to those, because they will ensure that you get CPE credit for today's session. I want to begin by introducing our panelists, and I want to ask each of them to share a little bit of their background and describe their current role. I'd like to begin with Jonathan Warsh, who is a senior policy advisor at the Department of Health and Human Services, as part of the COVID-19 response team. Jonathan?
Thanks, Jonathan. Good to be with all of you. My name is Jonathan Warsh. I'm, as Jonathan said, a senior policy advisor on the HHS COVID response team. I came to the federal government previously from state government, where I was working on pandemic response in the state of Michigan for the first year or so of the pandemic. And in our current team, we focus on the range of cross-cutting issues that affect HHS. So we're sort of the organizational nerve center for issues that touch CDC, FDA, CMS, other components of HHS, and sort of perform that cross-agency coordination role internally with the White House. So we have been spending an enormous amount of time on the American Rescue Plan and implementing various elements of the spending associated with that plan, and very excited to talk to you about that today.
Thanks, Jonathan. Next, I'd like Josh Corman, who's a chief strategist at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Josh Corman. I'm an Emergency CARES Act hiring authority for a 1 year renewable up for 1 year more term as part of the pandemic response that Congress passed last spring. I'm what you get when you put a philosopher in the hacker community for a couple of decades. But I've held roles as chief security officer in the private sector. But I was recruited by Director Krebs last year after the pandemic to be the chief strategist and design and implement CISA's response to the pandemic, both for the protection of healthcare delivery during a once in 100-year pandemic and impact on hospitals amongst adversaries deliberately disrupting and degrading patient care when we need it most, but also in support of the interagency effort known as Operation Warp Speed, so we could develop and distribute first-of-a-kind cures to protect U.S. interests and the public. So I lead a massively multidisciplinary team and bring to bear some experience I drew upon from serving on a congressional task force for healthcare industry cybersecurity for a few years. So we try to put some hacker and executive mindset into the excellent ranks of the federal government over the last year to try to keep things reduce the harm possible, but there was so much harm that we're going to get into that we'll talk about why some of this rescue plan is necessary.
Thanks, Josh. And last but certainly not least, I want Anthony Orozos to introduce himself. And Anthony, I'm sorry if I messed up your last name there.
It's okay. It's Oroz. It's fine. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Oroz. I'm the Assistant Director for the Pharmaceutical Center of Excellence and Expertise in Customs and Border Protection. I know that's a mouthful, but we've been working very closely, as you know, CBP, where our main duty is facilitation and legal entry of all the goods coming into the United States. So I believe since March of last year, when the pandemic began, we set up a team, CCRT, the Cargo COVID Release Team, response team, to facilitate any pandemic, vaccines, PPE, everything, you name it, into the United States without delay. So I started with the PPE back here when that was a big mess, and everybody and their mother was trying to get in some kind of mask or gown into the United States, and that slowed down, and then we had the vaccines. So basically our team facilitates and safely make sure everything related to the pandemic gets into the United States. And we work very closely with the private industry, the drug companies, the PPE producers, to give us a heads up when they're having shipments in. So to this day, I remember working on Thanksgiving night of last year, facilitating the first Pfizer vaccine into the United States, into a free trade zone. So haven't stopped since, and every shipment of vaccine or vaccine material that comes into the United States, we pretty much have our hands on one way or another. So that's pretty much sums up what I do.
Well, thank you, Anthony. You know, one of the common themes across all of your introductions was the vaccinations, and the need to ensure that people could get the vaccines, whether it's them being created, as Josh described, or distributed, that distribution processes that HHS is involved in, that Jonathan talked about, or just getting them into the country, like Anthony talked about. The vaccine is obviously has changed a lot of the game. Still complicated, but obviously it's made a tremendous difference in all of our lives so far. So, Jonathan, maybe we could just jump back to you, and can you talk a little bit about the processes that HHS is involved in relative to American Rescue Plan for vaccine distribution and other activities within the agency? I think I read recently that there was, more than $3 billion of funding sent to state and local governments for vaccine distribution activities.
Yeah, so, if you look at the American Rescue Plan funding, I believe there was about $150 billion that went to HHS. And of that $150 billion, a large amount, 30–40%, was just around vaccine distribution. Some of that money we funneled to community health centers, to pharmacies. Some of it went to FEMA, which was setting up mass vaccination sites. And so, for, I would say, the first quarter of this year, a very large amount of our effort in our funding was just getting the vaccine out and available in as many distribution channels as possible. I think it's, you hear these stories. I think I heard for the NBA Finals that you could get a vaccine at, the stadium where the Bucks were playing, and they were going around and saying, hey, you want to take a bathroom break, go get your vaccine. But in the early days, it's easy to forget that it was not widely available. And it took our state partners, time to figure out how to get distribution channels right. And so that included the healthcare ecosystem. It included, pharmacies. It included local public health offices. And so there was just a really huge amount of our time and effort on the logistics, the operations of getting the vaccine out there, and FEMA played a really large role, especially with a lot of these mass vaccination sites. As a sort of former state official, I would say that the states and local governments deserve a huge amount of the credit for a lot of this work. It took them time to figure out how to get this up and running. But the vast majority of these vaccines are being, distributed and run by local operations. And so I just want to make sure to call that out. there was a bit of a shift, I would say, once supply inflected with demand. And so we, in the last several months, have spent a lot of our ARP dollars and a lot of our time on vaccine outreach and education. And the amount of time it took to get to 50% of the country vaccinated, I believe, is less than the amount of time it took to get from 50% to 70%. And so every incremental, all the incremental progress that we are making now takes time, it takes effort. There's been a lot of, we're sort of in early days of research and understanding on this. I spend a lot of my time now on public health outreach and education. And, I think contrary to a lot of popular opinion, people who are choosing not to get vaccinated now are not monolithic. And so we are sort of really in the early stages of understanding why people don't want to get vaccinated, what might convince them to do so. And so that really has been the shift in HHS's efforts over the last, I would say, 2 to 3 months is much more about vaccine outreach, vaccine education, funding local community organizations, funding faith-based organizations that are doing this work on the ground. And I guess the last thing I'll say about this is we are also planning for a future, but a future that is unknown. We don't know yet whether or not people will need boosters. Our outreach strategy, our delivery strategy, we're building that in real time, but we don't know. I think folks probably saw there's new CDC guidance on masking that's coming out right now. That's another factor. So broad range of activities, but the nature of the work really has shifted as the situation on the ground has shifted with regard to the pandemic.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I think, the vaccine distribution in those early days was a tremendous workflow challenge. That it was very confusing, but it was also quite a complicated effort behind the scenes. And, you're right, the state and local governments, really stepped up and played a huge role. And, I think a lot of people have thought about, is there a better way if we have to do this again, instead of replicating this, countless times across all these local governments? But, I haven't heard anybody describe something better. A national approach seems somewhat out of reach at times. So I think your perspective is a really interesting one, having served in the states, in state government, and now from an HHS perspective. I want to turn to Anthony. What are the complexities to make what Jonathan was describing work? How does it work at the border in order to get vaccines into the right hands so they can get to that state health office or county health office? Certainly, it's not simple.
No, in the beginning it wasn't. It's certainly gotten more simple over the past few months. I think we take pride also in working directly with the private industry. That would be the drug companies of Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca. We always had a personal relationship with these large companies. We know we're in the enforcement business in CBP, obviously, but we know these large legitimate businesses aren't the business of fraud. So we work very closely with them. And they were giving us a heads up on the possible vaccine importations from Belgium and over in Europe long before they ever came into the country. So we were well aware that we were working with them. They had vaccines in the country before it was even approved. So they were in the free trade zone, ready to go, millions of doses. So as soon as that authorization was approved, it got out to the states as quickly as possible. After it gets in the country, we kind of lose it there because CBP, we're a border agency mostly, right? Mm-hmm. But luckily now, that's slowed down quite a bit. Now, the vaccine makers actually, they import vaccine materials almost every day, and we have an eye on that. But a majority of the vaccine now is actually produced in the United States, so CBP doesn't have much involvement with that. Just getting those vaccine materials into the country safely and securely, and make sure they're expedited. They come to different ports every day. We reach out to those ports personally. We have a relationship with over probably 20 ports that these vaccine materials have come in. So they know us, they know the companies now, we have a great relationship. So everything pretty much is seamless at this point. Let's knock on wood on that one, right? Because in the beginning, the PPE was just a complete mess. But things have really settled down. We're kind of in a routine now. And now we're also focusing on counterfeits too. So that's mainly going to be our focus moving forward. I don't think counterfeits they're not a huge issue, as other drugs are right now, because, the vaccine's free, right? So how counterfeiters make any money if they're, if we're giving
Right.
the vaccine for free at this point, right? So they're not going to make too much money off of that. But, there's always that threat there. In other countries, we have seen counterfeit vaccines where they were having trouble getting the legitimate vaccines. So they haven't made it way over our border yet. And hopefully, like I said, we don't see that anytime soon, but we do keep our eye out for certain things like that.
Thank you. I want to turn to Josh now. And, Josh, you've talked about healthcare impact related to COVID. And, I'm curious your thoughts there. And, also, what was the role that, CISA had relative to Operation Warp Speed and the creation of the vaccine, which you referenced in the beginning, in your opening remarks?
Sure. I guess I'll go in reverse order. We really had two major elements to the CISA support of the federal government and state, local, tribal, territorial. It was the keep hospitals, the national critical function of provide medical care, keep them as open and undisturbed as possible during peak needs to avoid excess deaths, which were numerous, and to provide cybersecurity and physical security support to the cyber assurance level of effort in Operation Warp Speed. So for the designated, funded, granted large organizations that were trying to invent the world's first vaccines for this style of virus, they had significant federal funding and assistance to make sure that we were doing threat intelligence and counterintelligence and marshaling taxpayer-funded resources to keep them safe and running. But one of CISA's tasks as the nation's risk management advisor was to identify the smaller, less obvious weak links in the supply chain that, if disrupted, could have a profound impact on public safety, human life. So whereas the large pharmaceuticals in the world have very robust global teams for risk management, some of these other organizations that might make a key ingredient in DNA or mRNA, we developed a ball bearings strategy, stealing from World War II doctrine, for these less guarded organizations, some of which had 3 IT people, 0 security people on staff, and would not withstand even the most basic of attacks that could introduce months of delay. After we knew we could invent these successfully and get them through approval, and then scaled production and fill and finish, hopefully not disrupted by ransom attacks and the scourge of ransomware hitting all these organizations, then the last part of that shared responsibility between the federal government, kind of Operation Warp Speed, stopped at the distribution points, and then it became state, local, tribal, and territorial. And luckily, CISA's mission to include coordination with SLTT allowed us to maybe bridge that divide a bit for that last 1,500 miles in a lot of cases on ultra cold storage, minus 80 degrees Celsius, to keep cold things cold long enough to get into people's arms. And now we're shifting in that era where the key constraint is really hesitancy. We have plenty of supply, and we have plenty of that we're exporting, but we don't have yet enough people taking this for misinformation, disinformation, and other varied reasons. The net result of both the attacks, let's shift to healthcare though, because this is where I think it's going to take us years to recover. The net result of both the pandemic itself on our limited healthcare institutions and unprecedented levels of cyber attack and this elective sickness from people that aren't taking the available vaccine is really throttling our provide medical care. We saw that when the US in February hit the 500,000 mark of lost Americans to the disease. What was talked about less is the CDC tracks excess deaths, the difference between expected deaths and actual deaths. And on that same day, we had crossed 150,000 non-COVID deaths, with the top demographic being age 25 to 44. Young people were passing away from otherwise treatable conditions, from delayed and degraded patient care, things like heart attacks, things like strokes, things like diabetes, that weren't getting timely care because there was no room in our finite hospital supply chains and hospital institutions. So most of that delay and excess death came from people not wanting to go to the hospital or not being able to get in because of bed count. But towards the fall, some of that delay was exacerbated by record high attacks on hospital institutions or ransom crews. If minutes or hours can be the difference between life and death for heart attacks and strokes, respectively. What do you think 4 weeks did to the state of Vermont with 118 institutions down for a protracted period of time? That would be that would increase mortality during the best of times, absolutely, during a pandemic when we already have so little room. So the long term of this is everyone keeps celebrating in a good way that our mortality rates are going down when people are vaccinated, if they still get sick. But these heavy loads on the national critical functions still put us in the danger zone for those excess deaths from non-COVID related conditions. So it's not merely amount of how many people are dying that we are continue to be concerned about. It's what is the additional strains and stress on hospitals who have less revenue from no elective surgeries, less hospital staff and doctors and nurses who are retiring early from stress and strain, and less capacity to treat the sick and wounded for long periods of time. It will take easily 5 years to get to full fighting strength again, even once the pandemic's over. So it's not merely that we want people to get vaccinated for fear of mortality. We also want to get people vaccinated to reduce the strain and stress on materially weakened healthcare delivery.
So I think this is a place where, I'd love to hear from Jonathan and an HHS perspective. There's a core part of the HHS mission, which is around recovery, in the ARP, recovering the way the country operates. And, Josh, you're hitting on one of the core aspects of that recovery. So Jonathan, how do we get back to where we were? Is it going to take 5 years? Are there ways to do it faster? Does the ARP support that?
I think the answer to that question depends on how well we control this virus now. This feels like a lifetime ago, but in the early stages of the pandemic, the biggest problem that we had, not just the cyber threats that I think Josh was talking about, but also the financial threats to the healthcare system that came as the result of the pandemic. So we had hospitals across the country that were facing insolvency because the vast majority of their business, even though many of them are nonprofit organizations, was threatened. Right, there were months when people were not allowed in hospitals or in most areas of the healthcare system for because the system was overwhelmed and the non-elective procedures or elective procedures were shut down, all that sort of thing. We've gotten to a better place right now. Those kind of relief payments that were the hallmark of the early pieces of legislation have gone by the wayside. I think some of us now are looking at the numbers that are rising, the COVID case levels, and we're very concerned about what that might mean for the healthcare system. So I think, right now things are okay. The system is not overwhelmed in most parts of the country. We do think about worst case scenarios, right? There's a variant right now that our vaccines are effective against. One can imagine a scenario where that virus mutates and there are future variants where our vaccines don't address the variant of a future mutation. So I will say, with regards to the ARP, there's a reason why our focus is so aggressively on getting more people vaccinated. It's because it's the linchpin to everything. And I think, candidly, most other, departments that aren't on this call would say the same thing. I think if you talk to Treasury, they would say that, the long-term financial outlook is dependent on people getting vaccinated. If you talk to education, they would say that the success of the education system is dependent on people getting vaccinated. And so, I think where our healthcare system is in a much more stable place than it was, but it feels like we're a little, I wouldn't say on a knife's edge, but but something like that. The last sort of point that I would make about this is, and this has been written about pretty extensively, but the pandemic really did expose some pretty gaping holes in the healthcare system, particularly with regard to equity. So you saw in the early stages and even now really large gaps in access to care, in COVID in prevalence, in COVID morbidity and mortality rates in communities of color across the country. And I think when you talk about, is it going to take 5 years? It's probably going to take at least 5 years for us to start to address those gaps. And I think, I wouldn't call it a silver lining because it's a pandemic and millions of people have died, but we are focused now very heavily at HHS on what are the structural changes that need to be made to the healthcare system, generational type changes that will prevent the kinds of disparities in access to care and coverage that we saw during the course of the pandemic.
So, those are great points. Before I joined ServiceNow, I worked at USDA for many years. I was the chief information officer there, and healthcare in rural America was always a challenge. And obviously, the opportunities now that exist with telemedicine and changes that were made within the broader HHS universe to support telemedicine have made a big difference. And but you do need broadband access at times, and you need connectivity to support that. So it's complicated, but whether it's a underserved community in a city or in rural America, Jonathan, I think your points are well taken. We've shown a lot. A light's been shined on some prevailing issues in the system, and now the question is, will the American Rescue Plan and related future legislation really help us change fundamentally how we deliver these kinds of services? So
if I can piggyback off one thing he said.
Yeah, I'll just say one other point to make there. I think
Jonathan, go ahead.
I'll just be very quick and then I'll turn it over to Josh. I think your point about telemedicine is very well taken. It's something we have talked a lot about in terms of access to care. There's been a dramatic upsurge, particularly in things like telepsychiatry, telehealth and mental health. It's types of care that actually can continue off into the future that the healthcare system was very reticent about for years and years and years. And now that so many people have taken advantage of these services and are finding care that they didn't have before, I think it's incumbent upon us at HHS to start to evaluate what are the elements, the changes to the healthcare system that we could make, sort of more permanent. What are the insights that we gained from the last year and a half that can guide us into the future?
Now I have 2 points to pivot off of that. Excellent set of points. One is I concur from a different agency perspective on the need to really fight this hesitancy and get more people vaccinated. One of the reasons is of the 55 national critical functions that we track at CISA, the health dashboard of the country's operations, the essential critical infrastructure workers for those 55, those are the ones who are getting sick and dying. Those are the ones that if we aren't careful, these are the ones that support our transportation, our power, our water, our pipelines. They don't have a very deep bench. And one of the things revealed to a second point is that some of the system dynamics revealed about our preparedness here. We used to look at a healthcare ransom as the number of records lost for PHI or HIPAA violation, or the cost of recovery, or maybe lost revenue. But now we're looking at the effect of mortality rates or excess deaths for degraded and delayed patient care. The unit has shifted significantly. And what it has revealed, not just for healthcare, but for a lot of these ransom attacks, is that these are target rich, but cyber poor. And when we look at cyber poor, it's no longer useful to just say, why don't you use a zero trust architecture or implement multi-factor authentication and best practices? When we did the task force for healthcare for Congress in 2017, our estimate was that 85% of US hospitals didn't have a single cybersecurity person on staff, not even one. So when we're saying you should be more cyber resilient, but we've never really invested that and understood that with great connectivity comes great responsibility, we have very prone and easy to disrupt healthcare across the 6,000 or so US hospitals. And that's not going to change unless pretty big structural changes take place. And given how easy it is to knock them down, how long they stay down, and how pronounced the impact could be, now that we're talking to Congress about maybe measuring these impacts and loss of life, this has more political will, more attention, more severity, and things will have to change.
So some really good points, Josh, and I think it demonstrates just the complexity of our environment overall. We love the fact that things are connected when they work, and we can order a pizza online very quickly. But when it's impacting our ability to receive proper health care, you call into question some of these things and the vulnerabilities around it. So, it's I think again it highlights the increasing complexity of the very connected nature of our world, and specifically our government, in this case. I want to turn back to Anthony for a second. We're thinking about this, the interconnections between entities in the government and private industry. You mentioned in your remarks earlier, Anthony, about how significant the collaboration has to be between CBP and industry. Can you expand on that a little bit? I think there's some, interesting points to be made there.
Sure, absolutely. Well, when I first started in 1995, the saying when we're from the government, we're here to help, and everybody ran for the exits. So I think it's changed quite a bit since 1995. We really, we're proud of our partnerships with the private industry. I mean, we have to pick and choose, and we do a betting on certain companies. Like I said, these large pharmaceutical companies aren't in the business of fraud. They're trusted companies, and many of their employees are ex-CBP employees and Homeland Security employees and retired government employees. So we're kind of on the same page with that. But CBP for a while now, and I started with the CTPAT program, which is the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism program after 9/11. And that was a supply chain security program. And that really opened it up with the partnership between government and private industry. And what we did was we traveled all over the world. I'd probably been to about 40 countries with CBP and verified their supply chains. No matter the commodity, it could be a textile factory, a pharmaceutical factory. And we went around, we validated those supply chains to make sure they were secure, because at the time, and we still are, dirty bombs and different terrorist activities were going on that we had tried to prevent. So, I mean, it started with that, and the trust back and forth and with the private industry really developed from then. I think when it came to this, we already had a great relationship with the pharmaceutical companies. I'm with the Pharmaceutical Center, which just started about 10 years ago. We have centers for all 10 commodities within CBP. I'm with the Pharma Health and Chemical Center. So we focus on those companies. So if they are in the CTPAT program, which is still going strong to this day, some trade compliance programs that we already know and have a great relationship with these people. And we can trust them, and they can trust us to do the right thing here. So I think that really went a long way. And that's, since 9/11, it's 20 years in the making, and finally this pandemic happened. I think it really came together as far as partnerships go. We were quick to act. The communication was unparalleled. I mean, it was just great. We were back and forth. I mean, personal cell phones, personal emails, back and forth. We would call each other all hours of the night. If there was something that needed to get done, we did it. Mm-hmm. And I've come a long way, like I said, since we started. Government and private were totally two different entities that barely, spoke to each other unless they really had to. So we've come a long way.
I mean, it really goes to the interconnected nature of our country that Josh was alluding to. So I want to pause here and put up our first poll question, which is around the different components of the American Rescue Plan. We've been talking about vaccines and healthcare related topics, but the American Rescue Plan is more comprehensive than just healthcare. It's also about getting people back to school, and obviously there's a relationship there, and into offices. There was unemployment insurance, got some money. Overall cybersecurity and infrastructure got funding. So curious what our audience thinks the most important aspects are. So Melissa, if you can put those responses up when we get them. Financial recovery. And I think it was maybe Josh, you'd mentioned in your comments that, or maybe it was Jonathan, that Treasury would say financial recovery is dependent on a vaccine, or to your point that, it's all very everything we care about in our agency or our mission is dependent on some way relative to getting back to normal, getting a vaccine, turning a vaccine into a vaccination, or getting people back on their feet. So I'm curious, just building on this idea of financial recovery from an HHX perspective, Jonathan, if there are other programs or activities that you've been involved in that you might be able to share to provide some perspective to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, it's we don't have direct ownership over most of the financial recovery programs. We do work very closely. You know, there are large rental assistance programs that are being run out of Treasury and HUD that we work very closely on. There are, you know, obviously, you know, business loan type programs that we work with our colleagues on. I think, you know, we do work as well, as I kind of mentioned, with the healthcare system. So our responsibility from a kind of financial well-being perspective is to look at hospitals across the country, at community health centers, federally qualified health centers, and make sure that they are, you know, not suffering from sort of major financial, you know, solvency issues. But, you know, the other thing that I think has come up, I was, you know, sad to see homeowner assistance or rental assistance, whatever it was, got no votes. But, you know, the CDC for the last year or so, I want to say, has had an eviction moratorium, you know, in place. And that is set to expire. I think it was just litigated in court. And one way that we have been collaborating at HHS with other parts of the federal government on financial assistance matters is on outreach. So, you know, one of the things that we have done over the course of the pandemic is develop really, really extensive stakeholder relations operations. So we talk, I'm not sure how CDC spends their time, but it always seems to me like they spend 95% of their time talking to other stakeholders. I don't know how they get work done, but they talk to medical associations, they talk to community-based organizations, faith-based organizations. And so, you know, when it comes to a huge number of other federal programs that are available, you know, part of our job at HHS is to use this large infrastructure that we have to get the word out, to say that, you know, the eviction moratorium is ending, but there's, you know, this type of rental assistance that you might be eligible for. There are these kinds of federal loans that you might be eligible for if you're a business. And so HHS, I think, has taken a bit of a leadership role, not necessarily in administering all of these programs, but in working, you know, with our other federal partners to get the word out. There is a really large amount of public assistance. I mean, trillions of dollars of public assistance that has been available over the last, you know, year and a half or so, and not everyone recognizes that they might be available, they might be eligible for that assistance. So that's been, you know, a really significant focus for us.
That's interesting and somewhat unfortunate when the government makes programs available and people either don't have access or knowledge of them. You know, it's kind of a shame. And I think the promotion of those things and creating awareness is, you know, it's a responsibility that cuts across agencies, because the different agencies oftentimes serve the same person, maybe through different programs. And building that interconnection is, I think, one of the big challenges in government because of our disconnected nature again. But we all have a kind of a role in that. And I'm curious, Josh, if you want to talk a little bit about what you think the future might hold, whether it's around, you know, better integration across programs, or some of the future of healthcare that you were referencing before. We've talked a lot about what happened and how we're dealing with it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the future might look like.
Future gazing is always difficult. My hope is that we have the hard conversations and we confront some of the uncomfortable things that have transpired, and that there's substantive reform. I don't think the answer is simply, you know, giving people more stimulus. We have kind of a trio, sometimes a duo in CISA, which is the mission is to secure today, defend tomorrow, defend today, secure tomorrow. But there's a third one, which is build back better. And in a lot of cases, when someone's disrupted or, falls down from an attack online, the instinct is to back up and go back to the way things were. But the way things were may not have been very defensible. In fact, I'll state they aren't very defensible. So I think if we're smart about this, if you zoom out and look across the executive branch and legislative branch, some combination of the cyber executive order trying to ramp up the trust and transparency of the digital infrastructure that the federal government procures and operates is a tell. Ann Neuberger at the White House also put out a memo to CEOs and senior leadership of these owners and operators saying, this is your part. We need you to do your part too. We delegate so much of our critical infrastructure to privately owned and operated entities, including and especially healthcare. And then third, even today, I keep seeing new legislative proposals for maybe mandatory reporting of compromise to some of these cyber supply chains and software and IT and digital infrastructure, so that we can try to be left to boom before there's a mass or a larger impact to these things. So my hope is we come to terms with that there's a cost to connectivity. That cost has not been rendered visible, and that a sober reflection on where we are over dependent on undependable things is going to do two things. One, shore up our current exposure for the time being with the right kind of programs and reform on how we secure our digital infrastructure. And two is we try to drive into the ecosystem using the power of the purse and economic levers that we need more defensible, resilient infrastructure in the future. But current course and speed, we were always prey. The adversaries and predators got real hungry, and they're getting more brazen. So we have a lot of work to do. And if it's well-designed hacks to incentives, I think we might see a more sustainable future, but it's going to be ugly for the next few years, at least.
So I think you're pointing, you make, again, some really strong points. And the American Rescue Plan had, I think, $650 million in direct funding to CISA for improved cyber. And then the Technology Modernization Fund got $1 billion with, and agencies now have more flexible payment terms, or maybe no repayment terms for cyber related projects. Have you seen yet agencies try to take advantage of these funds? Have agencies, asked CISA for funding to support some of these things based on the ARP?
I will plead ignorance to how those conversations are going. I think we spend most of our days trying to figure out which Delta Plus variant or which county in America is the worst, and how to fix some of these twists and turns. I know that the public is done with COVID, but COVID is not done with us. But what I will say is some of these insights we had for these target-rich cyber poor, we've been asserting on the broader CISA programs. And I think one area here that can focus on building back better is I pushed pretty hard for something called CISA.gov/bad practices. So instead of hand waving at best practices that maybe aren't realistic, we pointed out things like, number one, I'm not going to do all of them, but I'm going to point out number one, that the use of unsupported and end-of-life software in service of national critical functions is dangerous and materially elevates risk to national security, national economic security, national public health and safety. And this had to come out when you look at the fact that that huge Microsoft Exchange attack that wreaked havoc on the planet, the number one market share of Exchange on the internet is unsupported. It's not an edge case, it's the norm. And when the standard we walk past is the standard we endorse, and to a certain extent, we can't be surprised when we have constant interruption to critical infrastructure if we look past unsupported and older software in use in critical infrastructure. So part of what we're trying to nudge towards is these recoveries should not merely go back to prone, but should look at sustainable, resilient, recoverable infrastructure. And we want to be a risk advisor on how that looks.
And the other point you made on the EO is the government has the ability to use its buying power to prompt agency, software manufacturers, hardware manufacturers, critical infrastructure that's tied into federal procurements to make changes. So Section 4 of the EO is all about security of the supply chain, software bill of materials, and other kinds of requirements around how you develop your software. And I know that a company like ServiceNow takes that very seriously, and we're already thinking about how those new requirements apply. And it's going to make a difference for companies that do business with the federal government. So, but that's only part of the story. To your point, there are a number of bills in Congress that are more comprehensive, perhaps. So we need to, I think this is an issue that's going to require a lot of close attention as we head into the future. Anthony, I just want to turn back to you for a moment, sticking with this theme about what does the future hold. You spoke about, a very positive trajectory at the agency, moved from 9/11 through COVID over approximately 20-year period. You've had a lot of positive improvement. What's next? How does it evolve from here?
It's a great question. To touch on what Joshua said, I did read an article that some hospitals were still using Windows XP as their networks in their hospitals and Windows 7, and I couldn't believe it myself, which isn't supported by Microsoft anymore. And I thought, oh my God, we are so far behind on this. But I digress here. The future is, we're so focused on the pandemic right now and certain things, but I can tell you one thing. Less money on office space and more working from home and remote working, which actually could be a positive for us in a lot of different ways. What we learned was during this pandemic now, we had certain experts on pharmaceuticals located in New York, where I am, as you can tell from my terrible accent, right? So we had these local pharmaceutical experts that were great. But now with the internet, but with the WebEx and the Microsoft Teams, which we use, we're finding that we have pharmaceutical experts who are way more knowledgeable than just the people we had in New York, over in Pembina, North Dakota, right? Down in Miami, Florida, over in Los Angeles, California, that were never on the same team before. But now, using a remote, we've been working from home for about a year now. We put them all together on the same team. And we finally caught up maybe to the private industry. And we have different team. We have the same team in different locations, not necessarily the New York field office or on an island anymore. Now we go throughout the entire country, CBP, I think it's 35,000 employees. And we can take the experts from each individual commodity, each subject matter expert, and put them all on one team throughout the entire country, which is absolutely amazing. And the knowledge that we've gained, even to train new people and to help train the people who were working on this team in the past. We have, we do chemicals. We have fresh college graduates with chemistry degrees coming right out of some Ivy League schools, if you can believe it, and our chemistry majors and coming into our team and just educating everybody on certain things that we have to deal with every day. And we would have never had that before, just being on, like I said, on an island in our own little geographical area. So I think the future is, obviously more telework and working from home, because it's actually worked really great for us, and we never really did this to this extent anymore. But the outreach, it's provided us with subject matter experts and expertise we could never dream of before this all happened.
Well, it's interesting you say you couldn't have dreamed it up, but all the technology was there. These things existed 3 years ago.
Yep.
2 years ago, we could have had these remote teams previously, and I'm sure some organizations did in some small way, but now it's very common. And pandemic sort of forced that. So you really hit on some great points relative to the future of work, hybrid environments. Not. And again, I worked in the federal government for a long time. I hired people for many years, and I looked for people in the DC area. Your point, I can now hire people anywhere. I know OPM is coming out with some guidance to support these kinds of requirements. The hardest part is changing the way we think about our teams and how we manage them. And we've been forced in this situation, but there's and I don't know that we're going back to before, but it requires some different skill sets.
I mean, Jonathan, before, like you said before, I needed a job filled, and I had candidates from New York, and I had 5 candidates. I didn't like any of them. Now I do a nationwide announcement, and we get 50 candidates that I can't choose. They're all so good that we have 10 to 20 that are so overqualified that it's hard choosing just one. So it's just amazing. Moving forward, it's just going to be, CBP is going to be so much better off, I think.
Jonathan and Josh, any comments to build on relative to the future of work? And I'm curious, in your agencies, in HHS overall, in DHS overall, will you be heading back into office space? Are you going to continue in a remote mode for the foreseeable future? I know plans are coming out, and some conversations are happening. So if there's anything you could share, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. Jonathan, if you could start.
Yeah. I think it's interesting you say this about the tools already existing. I was previously working in state government in Michigan, state capital's Lansing, and Lansing's a very fine city, but it's not the talent base in Michigan. The talent base is the Metro Detroit area. And so, when we were trying to recruit talent, it was like, well, if you live in Detroit, are you really going to drive an hour and a half to Lansing every day to go to work? It really limited us from a talent recruitment perspective, even in that local market. And I think, the points that Anthony was making are true at the federal level as well. HHS has been very, very cautious, I think rightfully so. We have to kind of walk our own walk here when it comes to coming back to the office. There are certain elements that have started to come back in. There's a very large HHS team that is working on the situation on the southern border and influx and immigration as it relates to unaccompanied children. That team is, a lot more in person and sort of a, sort of incident command kind of mode. But the vast majority of HHS has been remote, and we don't know yet what the future will hold. There's been a series of surveys. I think if you talk to people, I think most people fell somewhere in the middle. They would value seeing their colleagues and developing some relationships a day a week, 2 days a week. But particularly my colleagues who have kids, they're losing so much time in transit, coming into HHS every day and parking and the rest, that they're more efficient doing the work from home. And I think there's a certain kind of gut check here, which is like, well, we've been able to manage pandemic response from home. So maybe when it's not a giant public health emergency, we could also manage that from home. So my suspicion is that we'll probably land with some kind of hybrid in the future. But I think, getting back to kind of our earlier conversation about vaccine hesitancy, the Delta variant, I think, is really, hitting the pause button on a lot of plans that I think folks had to come back to the office shortly after Labor Day. So I would endorse everything Anthony said about recruitment and talent and, the opportunity this presents, but it does require us to change the way that we think about work and our teams and being in communication and FaceTime and all the rest of it. So I suspect we're not going back is kind of, full time is where I would land.
So, it's interesting, I think, about what you said in the Delta variant. I just read that the VA yesterday has stated that they are going to mandate vaccinations for healthcare workers. And I'm curious if that's the beginning of a trend in maybe other agencies, or if you want to come back into an office space. And many people do, people, are tired of either working at home or they appreciate it. We know we can ask, employees if they're vaccinated. They might not have to say, but I'm just curious if you see that's maybe a coming for us.
Well, it wasn't just the VA yesterday. It was also New York City government as well as California state government. So, those are very, very large entities that are saying, either get vaccinated or prepare to be tested once a week. I think it's going to be, the federal government, it's challenging, right? It's very hard for one agency to just go it on its own. So my suspicion is that these are active conversations occurring within OPM right now, and we'll probably get guidance on it in the future. I think, we tend not to like mandates in this country. So I think there's a lot of hope that people will sort of act on their own. The VA is a healthcare system, so it's a little bit of a different situation. But I think New York City and California state government are really sort of interesting examples, and probably suggest, that there's more of that to come.
So, Josh, we'll get to you in a second. I want the second poll question to be shared, and this is, again, building on the future. Where should we be putting our spending going forward as government? Building on these, core themes of the ARP, and I think I know what Josh is going to guess. But so the future of work, Josh, what does it look like? It says in DHS, to the extent you're aware, and how does all this telework and the future of telework hybrid teams impact our cyber posture too?
Well, the notion of going back to normal. I also teach for CMU. So a lot of CISOs come through, and the notion of going back to normal isn't on anyone's lips. It's the new normal is essentially a hybrid of some work has proven to be doable and even improved by telework permanent. Some work, depending on the mission space and what's going on, may be hybrid, sometimes in the office, sometimes not. And obviously the third permutation is some jobs have to go back to work and will benefit from going back to work. I think specific to our agency, we were growing so fast, and as the mission space is growing so fast, and the NDAA and the rescue plan, there isn't enough space for everyone. I've been running pandemic strategy out of sunny Dover, New Hampshire. So I don't think I'll ever set foot in Glebe during my my time as a federal employee. But this new normal will come with net new attack surface too, and people need to factor that into the overall economics and risk of this, because we stood up a lot of remote access technology in a great big hurry that bypassed our normal standards of care because we had to. It has to, if we're going to keep some of that old attack surface and the new attack surface, that'll require some really good, thoughtful evaluation and hardening as well.
And I think our audience is agreeing, because you may have seen 2/3 of those who answered the poll said we need to invest in cybersecurity, and second was infrastructure. So we're getting close to the end of our time, and I know we're going to have another poll question, but I want to ask if you can each share one final lesson learned from our from your experience over the past 15 months, whether it relates to the future of work and hybrid, or the American Rescue Plan activities directly, or just what you learned personally, in dealing with the pandemic. So, Anthony, if you can begin, I'd like to.
If I had to point out one thing, I think it would be communication. I think it's always important, but now more than ever, what we're doing right now, we don't have to meet in person. It's super easy to give somebody a video call. I haven't seen my boss in 2 years, but we video call every day. It's like I see her every day, right? So not just within the agency, but also with the private industry also. So communication is the key there. And we've communicated, it's forced us to communicate a lot more, but we figured out ways to do it and effective ways to do it. And now it's going to be the norm, like you were saying. So communication is key. We need to keep this going as far as, and like I said, this is a new normal. It's not going to stop. Once we started doing it, it's going to keep going. But it was, it's really eye-opening. It was good.
Well, eye-opening for sure. And I know we're going to have another poll question in a moment, and it's going to be, what does the future of work look like for our audience? And curious what they're going to say. And where things come out, but eye-opening is I think a great way to think about the last 15, 16 months or so. Jonathan, a lesson learned to share.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's that you can't catch up on infrastructure investments in a quick, in a hurry. I've been focused on our public health infrastructure, but our public health infrastructure has been underinvested in for decades, and suddenly there's a crisis and everyone wants to go out and hire 1 million public health professionals to do contact tracing and testing and vaccinations. They don't exist because we didn't train them and we didn't build that infrastructure up over those decades. And so it's paying for stuff that you're going to need in the future, and no one likes that because you don't know when you're going to need it. It's not instant gratification, but infrastructure investments, long-term, critical.
Well, you may have seen that the poll was answered that the future of work is hybrid for 87% of our audience, and just build infrastructure is a lot of